Hi everybody and welcome to Ideal Postcodes' first ever webinar. Please feel free to tell us what we get wrong and how we can improve. I'll definitely look forward to reading some of those comments and the replies. It's great to have you with us today as we explore property data management and how it's evolving and changing. We'll also have a look at what the future holds. Before we dive into today's discussion, just a quick bit of housekeeping. Please feel free to drop in questions and comments throughout the chat and we'll get through as many as we can towards the end. And we also have a poll running, the poll running for the webinar, and please feel free to add your answer into the comments there. The question is, what do you think is the biggest challenge in property data management today? The answers being ensuring data quality, accessing the necessary data, analysing and cross-referencing other data sets, building a business case for data investment, and improving data literacy. We'll reveal all the results towards the end of the session, so please stick around. There'll also be a recording of this webinar, which we'll be sharing with everybody after today's session. So on to today's agenda. Initially, we're going to be talking about the data available in the property sector, and then UPRN and enhanced data, the practical uses of UPRN, how the data is accessible in terms of where you can get hold of it, and the Red Letter Initiative, which one of our panelists is an integral part of the creation. And then finally, we'll have a look at the future trends. So moving on to our panel of experts in the sector. We have a fantastic panel with us here today who will share their valuable insights and experiences. We aim to give you a clearer understanding of property data and how it's shaping the industry. So firstly, we have Emily Griffiths from Ordnance Survey. Hi, Emily. Can you give us a little bit about your background and expertise, please?
Hi, Nick. So my name is Emily Griffiths. I'm the Strategic Product Manager for the Address and Location portfolio at Ordnance Survey. So as the name would suggest, I look after our address-based products, the NGD address theme, other good stuff like our postcode products and boundary line. I've worked with address pretty much my whole career, so primarily focusing on data quality, data management, and now moving into making sure that customers can get the best from that data.
Wonderful. Thanks, Emily. And our next expert is Simon Barlow from GeoPlace. Simon, could you also share a bit about your background and expertise, please?
Morning, Nick. Hey, everyone. My name is Simon Barlow. My background is in the property sector. I originally started working in property information services, moved into commercial property asset management, and then into the original development of the technical and data standards and building the original national address and street gazetteer infrastructure that all the UPRNs and USRNs come out from now. I currently head the insights and consultancy team at GeoPlace, advising organisations on their address data management strategies, and I really enjoy the opportunity that gives me an experience to support our ever-growing community of data providers and data users.
Wonderful, thanks, Simon. And finally, we have Dan Hughes. Dan is the founder of Alpha Property Insights and the Real Estate Data Foundation. Dan, can you give us some insights about your background and potentially a brief tease about the Red Letter Initiative?
Yeah, good morning. Really good to be here. Thank you very much for having me. So, as you said, Dan Hughes from Alpha Property Insights. I spent my career working across the built environment, from planning to fund management and everything in between. And most of that's been looking at data, the use of data and how that operates across the sector. And obviously, address data and UPRNs are absolutely key to that. So Alpha Property Insights, a consultancy that works with organisations to understand digital transformation of the sector and also data approaches. And one of the things that came across a number of years ago, having worked at organisations like RICS, is that there needs to be a really collaborative approach to things when it comes to data. And so the Real Estate Data Foundation is a not-for-profit that's been going for around 5-6 years, that brings together all of the different stakeholders in the sector to just explore data, how we can work better, improving the interoperability, and also raising data ethics. So it's an organisation that's supported by around 15 industry bodies, primarily in the UK, although there's some international work there as well. And we've written a couple of letters with the sector or on behalf of the sector to ministers about the UPRN, calling for certain things to happen, both from the property sector, but also from the public sector. And maybe we can get into some of those things a little bit later.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Dan. Okay, moving on to our first topic in the agenda, which is we're going to be talking about the data in the property sector. Obviously, the property sector is showing signs of good growth and recovery since the pandemic, and house prices have been steadily increasing. The property market is said to be worth around 380 billion by the end of 2025. And today we're going to discuss how data, primarily UPRNs, are transforming the property sector. So Emily, I'd like to kick things off with you. It's okay?
Yeah.
How's the role of data in the property market evolved over the last few years?
I think probably for me, the main thing that's evolved is around accessibility. So things that have previously been held in analog format are now being digitized and sort of aggregated into national data that everyone can use. I think we're also seeing that the data that people want is becoming more sophisticated. So where previously sort of just knowing what something was called, now people want to know as much about it as possible to inform those decisions.
And, is it becoming crucial for businesses to make more data-driven decisions based on this data?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, from a sort of commercial perspective, if other people are doing it, you need to do it too. Otherwise, you're sort of losing out competitive ground there. So if you have more data, the more accurate your decisions can be. So choosing who you lend to, choosing where to buy, the more information you can feed into that, the more accurate those decisions can be.
Wonderful, thanks, Emily. And Simon, what gives enhanced property data the edge over more traditional data sets?
Well, I guess if you think about it, if you look at what you call traditional data, describe it as, say, a list of addresses, residential addresses, commercial addresses that are typically postal addresses. You have names of the occupier and the business at those locations where you traditionally send a letter to or a bill to fulfill your service requirements. Over time, I guess postcodes were used from those addresses to do a bit more. Some of the things that Emily was describing. The postcode was originally developed for delivery of mail. So typically one use case for those addresses. Over time, those traditional addresses have been used for more and more. So first real example, I guess, that most people would be familiar with is supermarkets aggregating household data based on postcodes, deciding where to build their next superstore, for example. So if we take that sort of a step further and some of the things that Emily was talking about, we enhance that data model around addressing. We add more attribution to suit multiple use cases rather than single ones, make it more granular, make it more frequently updated, add more attribution. And then importantly, add in the immutable identifiers against those addresses to make sure that those identifiers persist through the life cycle of the property. So when they're built, when they're constructed, when they're converted, demolished, they have the same identifier, which can then follow through in your data management strategies. So I guess, all that, the advanced enriched data model and addressing is really useful for that advanced analytics you want to do at the property level rather than the aggregated level.
Thanks. Thank you. I'll move on to Dan. Dan, can you share any examples of insights or trends that have surfaced recently?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it depends which context you're talking about what recently means. So the real estate sector is typically talking about years or decades or centuries, and data is talking about seconds and milliseconds. So I think that it's probably those two different things coming together, which is actually a lot of the problem. So if you look at how the operations of the property sector worked, let's say 10 years ago, then actually it wasn't particularly data driven. There were very specific data sets like the size of a building or the price of a building, but it wasn't really too fast moving. So actually those data sets were fine. Where we are now is that the sector is significantly more focused on moving quickly. Now that's all relative, so it's still relatively slow, but it needs to be much more people focused, much more understanding about what's going on with the building or around it, or the impact on the planet. And all of that needs data. So one of the big trends that we've seen probably over the last 5 to 10 years is a gradual understanding that there is a lot of data out there and we need a lot of data. And a really good example of that is if you look at some of the government policy. So if you look at the planning reform that's going on, data is at the heart of that. If you look at building safety, data is at the heart of that. The Renters Reform Bill or the Renters' Rights Bill, short-term letting, home buying selling process, all of those are not about data, but all of those have data as a significant part of the solution that's going on. And so the property sector generally is in a very rapidly for the property sector, although arguably still quite slow, is maturing in its understanding that data is really, really important, and the management of data is essential to solve those problems. Where we haven't got to yet is understanding that doing it just by silo is a problem. So we need to be able to tie those data sets together and bring it together. And that's, for example, where the UPRN is incredibly powerful.
Excellent. And how do you think that the data has changed the way property businesses operate currently?
Well, I think generally speaking, you say better decisions, more efficient and improving. There are some interesting examples where actually the use of data isn't necessarily helping some places. So the home buying selling process, for example, is arguably not getting faster, even though there's a lot of data and technology that's being used. I think that's probably for slightly different reasons. But overall, I would say that the use of data is providing more assurance, it's providing better insights, it's providing people to change and make things happen much quicker.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Okay, brilliant. Thanks to our panelists there. So moving on to our second point of the agenda, looking at UPRNs and enhanced data. So UPRNs are becoming increasingly significant across multiple different sectors, and their adoption is growing rapidly. Since the UK government mandated the use of UPRN to the public sector systems in 2020, we've seen the impact in a range of industries. But how are they shaping the future of the data in the property sector? So Simon, taking a few steps back, UPRNs are becoming increasingly crucial to the property market. Can you explain what UPRNs are, please?
Sure. So UPRNs are unique identifiers that are assigned to addressable objects in the real world. They're a machine readable number up to 12 digits in length, and it endures through the life cycle of the property. So from when planning application is made and it goes through to a formal approval, each local authority would go through a street naming numbering process, which is a formal legal process, and UPRNs are assigned at that stage. So that UPRN is then monitored through the construction, occupation, conversion and demolition phases, and stays with that particular real world location through that life cycle. Alongside that process of creating the UPRNs for that point in space, some other mandatory attributes are collected, and they form part of the larger data set that's alongside it. And that might be a geometry, so where it is in the real world, how it's accessed from the street and road network in the form of an address, as well as what it is. So is it a residential semi-detached dwelling? Is it an office building, or it is a retail or a resident industrial unit, for example? So in the UK, UPRNs are assigned through GeoPlace to each and every local authority, and the local authority then use them in their own internal processes to manage and monitor their own property-related activities. So, for example, refuse collection, council tax, planning, school catchment areas, for example. So those UPRNs have become really important for local authority service delivery, connecting location-based decisions and those data conversations that happen internally, and more recently with other organisations that want to talk about location, particularly as those conversations become ever increasingly digital.
Brilliant, thanks. And Dan, excuse me, while UPRNs are gaining traction in the property sector, are there still some common misconceptions about them that you're aware of?
Yeah, I think the traction that they're getting is relatively slow but steady. So I think that over a number of years it's getting there, but there's still a long way to go. I think there are probably some misconceptions. One is just a general within a real estate side of things. If you're a real estate practitioner, you're typically very good at real estate practitioning, whatever that might be, whether that's an estate agent or a valuer or a property manager. You don't necessarily need to have understood the intricacies of data. And so the property sector is built very much around properties, obviously, and therefore people use addresses. So they will write down an address in their own system, in their own format, which makes perfect sense to them. The problem is that's great for a person to interpret, but it's not very good for computers, which is obviously where things like the UPRN are so valuable. So I think one of the problems is people don't necessarily understand the difference between postcodes, UPRN, writing an address down, all of those other identifiers, things like title numbers or UARNs, or whatever it might be. There's a misunderstanding about that. And in many ways, people shouldn't need to understand that if you're a property professional. We as a sector have a responsibility to help them understand that. I think the other thing is the UPRN, when people do understand it, does come with a cost. Now, and maybe we want to get into this a little bit more. There are a number of different costs that come with UPRN. One is the cost of the UPRN. Now, some of that is open, so if you have it, you can use it. But if you want to use address-based as a cost, there's also a cost of implementation. And if it's very difficult to justify the business case to use something unless everyone else is using it. And the property sector is very good at following and not so good at leading. So there are some examples of companies out there who are using the UPRN for everything, and they've really led the way. But until it becomes more popular, then less people are going to use it. So we get stuck in this chicken and egg situation. So I think probably misconceptions is, one is understanding about the data, which is where there's a responsibility of everyone to educate and to help property professionals in that space. And the second one is, I think there are costs, whether that's cost of data, cost of implementation, and some probably misconceptions about how expensive it is. But then there are some costs that are a barrier to that as well, I would argue.
And how do you think we can help property professionals better understand and utilise UPRN to unlock their full potential?
Well, I think there are two different things to that. One of which I think everyone would agree with, and the second one I think some people wouldn't agree with. So the first one is, there's a basic education about data as a basic concept within the property sector. The whole world is becoming more data driven. Every real estate professional, so working with organisations like GeoPlace and Ordnance Survey, have a role in this, but also professional bodies and companies have a responsibility to train and understand data. The world is becoming data driven. You can't do a role in the next year, 5 years, 10 years without becoming better educated in that. The second part is my view, and I know not everyone agrees with this, is that UPRN is actually not likely to be used by that many people on a person-to-person basis. It's more about tying the data sets within the computer systems. So actually, to a degree, whilst it would be beneficial for people in the property sector to understand the UPRN and what it is, actually it's more important to have it built into the systems. So it's more important about that behind the scenes, tying data sets together. So I think there are two things. Property professionals need education, which should include the basics of what a UPRN is, but then really making sure that it's built into all software systems and databases that are out there. And those two things will have a transformative effect on the property sector's use of data.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Dan. And Emily, moving on to yourself. What impact do you think UPRNs have on property management, and how do they help streamline the operations?
I agree with a lot of what Dan was saying, actually, in terms of the sort of the expectation that an average citizen will become sort of UPRN fluent is probably not where we're at today, but making sure that when those people do input their addresses into systems, and then the people using those systems want to kind of connect with other people, there's no error being introduced. We talk about flats quite a lot as a good example of that. So someone might say, I live on the ground floor flat, and actually someone else would describe it as flat A or flat 1. So if you have a data set behind all of that that can link those two things together, then you're removing kind of the introduction of error, which is an inefficiency in itself, and people can make cross-organization decisions with the same set of information. So I think we talked about it before, that the more people that adopt the UPRN, the more valuable it is. So that's a big thing for us. So where people are inputting data, making sure that behind the scenes it's all being joined up so that people are making the best decisions. I think also we're talking about some of the attribution that exists on UPRN. So it's more than just an address string and a set of 12 digits. There's information such as where that property is located, what it's being used for. So being able to kind of profile that if you're managing a portfolio of properties, sort of being able to sort of assess risk if you've got a lot of properties in the same area, or you're insuring properties that are sort of high risk use case. All of that information is really important, and the UPRN helps with that.
Okay, thank you. And alongside the points that Dan made, do you know of any other further misunderstandings of UPRN that become apparent to yourself?
Yeah, I think Dan touched on it briefly. It's the sharing of the UPRN being open, so it's open UPRN, which was introduced in 2020. So you don't have to have an address product in order to be able to share UPRNs. So the transacting of UPRN is possible for everyone, but I do recognise Dan's point that you would have to have the underlying data as well. But yeah, the sharing of the UPRN of itself is open.
Okay, thanks. And moving on to our third point of the agenda, We'll now look at the practical side of things and how UPRNs and enhanced data sets are being used in the property sector. We've all heard the phrase that data is the new oil, and it's no exaggeration when it comes to the real value of property data in this market. Let's explore some real world examples. So Emily, back to you. As part of Ordnance survey, as a key provider of this data, can you share any real world examples where the data is making significant differences?
Absolutely. I think for me, one of the most impactful examples of the data being used was in the sort of wake of the Grenfell tragedy, where there was a real push to identify similar buildings and assess the risk of a similar incident occurring. So the identification of those buildings that were over 18 metres was done with building height attribution. And then from that, we were able to look at the UPRNs within those buildings, so understanding how many properties were in that building and the nature of them, because of the government requirement to identify those tall buildings and the residential makeup of those buildings. So the use of the data in that scenario, and then the request from the building safety regulator to include the UPRN in that register so that other people could sort of understand that information as well. I think that's a really powerful example of where, commercial and public sectors sort of join together to try and deliver the best outcome.
Okay, thanks, Emily. And Dan, in your experience, how have you seen UPRNs being integrated into businesses' workflows?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think so. I sit with Simon actually on the Letting Industry Council's data and UPRN group, and we've been meeting with a number of software companies within the property sector, specifically looking at the lettings market. But I think this would apply across the board, that most companies have now built in the UPRN as a field into their software solutions. That means that the property sector either build it in automatically into their workflow, or they don't even know it's there and they still get the benefit of it. What's interesting is I think there's then a challenge about whether that data is being populated. I think there are probably two slightly different things here. So one is, moving forward, the cost of using a UPRN on a building by building basis is really very, very small. So that can just be built into solutions. If you already have a database of 100,000 buildings or 200,000 or whatever it might be, then the cost of actually updating that in retrospect is relatively expensive. And we can argue whether that's too expensive or not, and that's a different subject, but there's a cost that needs to be decided there. And so I think that the UPRN as a field and a concept is being built into many and most of the workflows that are out there at the moment through the software companies or central IT systems. Whether it's actually being populated and used is then the next step. And I think that in some cases it is, in some cases it isn't. And some companies have really built their businesses around the UPRN and others are away from it. So I think there's some way to go. I think it's a sort of really big step forward, but then the first of several steps forward that are needed.
Thank you. And Simon, in your experience, have you seen UPRNs being used in any other sectors or businesses in innovative ways?
Yeah, I guess there's two sectors that really stand out. One of the first sectors to really embrace and adopt the UPRN was the financial sector. So in particular, property insurers were quick to see the value of the UPRN, and they were able to hone their offer to their customer based on the specific location of the property, rather than in the past that used postcodes. You go on, say, what's your postcode, and then you would assign a property premium, insurance premium value based on the postcode. With the UPRN, they were able to differentiate and offer a better differential and premium offer to the customer based on the actual risk and perils of that particular property. So its proximity to a river or a flood zone, or I don't know, an industrial location, for example, would be very different within the same postcode, for example, of a property say half a kilometre away, which shared the same postcode. So they were quick to see the benefit of using that very granular level of address information from the UPRN. I guess linked to that, in the financial sector, lenders also started to adopt the UPRN to manage their mortgage in principle offer. So a lot of the consumer platforms that we all use, you're able to apply for a mortgage in principle, and using the UPRN, you could find out a lot of information about that property very quickly using the UPRN. Once you locked it to the address, you could see what type of attribution was available to that particular property and whether it was mortgageable So they were using that quite quickly to look at their mortgage lending, but also to manage, I think Emily mentioned this earlier, their lending exposure in a certain location. So using the UPRNs, they could say, well, how much are we lending in this particular area, and what type of properties are we lending against? Is our risk profile too large, or is it okay? The other sector is logistics. We're now seeing a lot of logistics and delivery companies using UPRN to improve their last mile delivery by better understanding what happens at the end of that journey. Using the UPRNs, they can look at the attributes linked to those UPRNs and think about how they could improve, or what they might experience at the end of that location in terms of parking, or how easy it is to offload their cargo, and the routing in terms of getting there. So particularly relevant in the property sector here for, say, new tenants, home buyers, moving into their new properties, and they want to connect utilities. Without those addresses and UPRNs, it's quite difficult to get those connections made. If you want to receive new furniture and appliances into the place you're moving into, you need to have those bits of information to hand. And of course, if you're moving into a property, everything's packed in boxes. You need to take away delivered to get something to eat on that first day of moving in. So a lot of delivery companies and logistics are using UPRN to improve that offer, improve their speed of delivery to the end consumer.
Thank you very much. Okay, moving on to our fourth part of the agenda, which is how is the data accessible? We've just heard how important the data is in shaping the property industry, so it would need to be available across many systems and platforms. So let's take a step back and explore how the data is made accessible, the challenges involved, and ensuring the property is up to date and ready for use. So Simon, we'll start with you. Can you walk through where the data comes from and how you gather it, please?
Sure, yes. So the reference data behind the UPRNs predominantly comes from each and every local authority across the UK. They're all responsible under statute for naming and numbering new streets and properties as part of the planning and building control process. So GeoPlace collects feeds of that data every day from local authorities, ensures it complies with the data standards the whole community is working to. And alongside that, we take in other feeds of national data and specific data sets to provide additional verification and attribution alongside that data. So, for example, we link UPRNs to Royal Mail's postcode address file, so we can make the link between a postal delivery address and an official geographic address from government. And we also link it through to the National Council Tax and Business Rates list from the Valuation Office Agency. And there are some other data sets we use to check the content and quality of the data to make sure that the attribution is the best it can be. So, for example, we take a list, a definitive list from the Care Quality Commission on the location of all the care homes and hospices, for example. We make sure that they're all in the database and they're all correctly classified with certain attribution. And there are a whole host of other ones which are applicable across the property sector, where we take those feeds and cross-validate.
Well, with all these different providers, it must be some challenges. I mean, are there any overlaps and complexities of the data? And who's also responsible for its governance?
Yeah, so there's about 500 or so different organisations, well over 500 that are providing us data. However, we introduced standards at the outset of the project, so that makes it easier for us to manage all that process. We work with all the data providers and their solution providers to make sure that those standards are adhered to, and those workflows can be maintained to make sure the quality and the content is up to date. It's a really active community. We pull together, and the providers of the data are also users of the data, so they're all incentivized to make it work and make it work well. So in terms of complexities and overlaps in the data, for us, mastering the data is really, really important to maintain that integrity in data. And GeoPlace fulfills that through an information governance framework. And that's put in place on behalf of the entire public sector. So we've identified local data stewards, people responsible for those types of attribution in each of the geographic and domain territories. And the governance we have in place puts in place that framework to validate it against the definitive source. So we make sure that the data coming in is coming from that organisation. If someone else tries to insert or edit a record that doesn't belong to them, we can trap that and make sure that that doesn't happen. We also use insights and intelligence from our user community. So if you're a user of the data, you can provide feedback, and we can cross-check and validate that to make sure that what someone is telling us can be checked in the real world. Ultimately, it's the local data stewards in the local authorities and some of the other organisations that were responsible for editing and changing any data that comes through that process. But that's kind of the role we play at GeoPlace, is to provide that governance framework for the whole system to work. So yeah, the system is well governed, and it's one of continuous improvement.
Wonderful, thanks. And Emily, Ordnance Survey plays a significant role in making this property data available. Can you share how you ensure UPRNs and other data are available across various different platforms, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of our premium and open products are available through our data hub, which is our platform to serve both our partners and our public sector users. Our products are available via API for those people who find that sort of the right route for them, and also available via download. As we move into our national geographic database era, so moving away from some of our traditional products like address base or OS master map topography layer, we're moving into more of a sort of a, as I say, database where data is held in themes. So there are 9 themes, of which address is one, buildings is one, land use is one. So you're able to, we call it select and build. So you're able to select the exact attributes you want, rather than having to buy kind of off-the-shelf products and have to stitch them together yourself and manage them that way. You can now select the exact record, the exact attribution you want from each of those themes, and sort of have your own custom recipe, which will be available potentially on a daily basis or monthly if that's preferable to you.
Okay, and what tools and processes do you have in place to make these integrations as easy as possible?
I think, to sort of Simon's point of continuous improvement, we're always engaging with our partner community and our public sector customers directly to understand the challenges there. So we have an indirect first model, so we don't sort of serve up those products in systems ourselves. So we need to make sure that we're in a constant dialogue with those system integrators to make sure that our products are not causing them pain, and people are getting the best use out of them possible. So we've got lots of user engagement sort of structures in place to make sure that those conversations are ongoing.
Okay, thanks, Emily. And Dan, when it comes to accessing property data, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges faced by property professionals?
I think we probably touched on some of these earlier, actually. It's about education and awareness and cost. And I think those two things sort of are real challenges for the property sector, but they don't always necessarily know or need to know about accessing them. Because if you look at the way that a typical property professional will access data, it's through several different systems. So an awful lot of people are very spreadsheet based at the moment, and then they will use a number of different software solutions to get some sort of information or store it, whether that's a CRM system or something else. And so actually the key to this is building in the UPRN into those solutions, rather than accessing it directly themselves, so it will come through. The problem with there is, until the property sector asks for it, or it's mandated by various different things from the public sector point of view, that need isn't there until the rest of the market does it, which then comes on to the red letter, which I know we'll pick up on in a little bit, about trying to move the overall market. So I think there's an element of awareness and trying to get that momentum behind it so it can really get adopted. And then secondly, the cost. I'm slightly cheating here and jumping to some of the questions. So there's some really good questions coming in from the audience. One of the questions there is about the costs and how big a barrier it is. I think that on a building per building level, if you want to find out something by a building, the cost to use the UPRN is absolutely minute. Therefore, I don't personally believe it is a cost at all. You could add that to the solution. I don't think it's in many circumstances it's much of a problem. Where it is a problem is where, if you have a database of all of those properties that you've collected over years and years, how do you get those UPRNs attached to that? And that's where there can be a much more substantial cost, and it's very difficult to justify if no one else is using it, and therefore that's where that business case comes into it. The third thing about the cost is the cost of implementation. It's not just the data, obviously. Even if everything was given away free, completely open, and all address base was open, then there would still be a cost to implementing stuff, and that needs to be considered as well. Just for the record, to specifically address the question that was in there, I think that low cost is really important. I think that making it affordable is really important. I don't think that means necessarily making it free in all situations. One of the most important things for me is that data is really well managed. And again, we can come back to that in a bit. Managing data costs money, and it needs to be funded. So I think there needs to be a good funding model, which may need some adoption of where it is now, or adaptation, sorry, of what's there now, but it needs to be managed properly.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Dan. Okay, moving on to our next part of the agenda. We're turning our attention to the Red Letter Initiative, which has been gaining renewed momentum in the property sector. So in 2021, the Red Letter was sent to key stakeholders in the property sector, calling for the widespread adoption of UPRNs to improve data efficiency across the industry. Dan, as one of the people who is behind the Red Letter Initiative and the founder of the Red Foundation, can you get us up to speed and walk us through where we are from the beginning to now?
Yeah, of course. So the Real Estate Data Foundation is really set up for two goals. So one is about bringing the sector together around the topic of data, and the second one is about data ethics, getting that up the agenda. For the purpose of this, I think it's the first bit that's probably most important. So if you look at the use of data just in the residential sector, if we focus on that, although I would say that this applies to commercial just as much, if not more, there are huge amounts of people using address data at the moment, or different identifiers, to understand where a property is. Bringing those together is very, very difficult. So there are some challenges which have already been mentioned. Emily was talking about the different naming conventions about flats, so you could use different names. But actually more than that, there's just a lot of inability to bring data sets together because everyone records everything slightly differently. So the number of conversations were going on across the sector within different industry bodies and within government about the UPRN, but there wasn't that mass momentum behind it. So in 2001, we worked together with the Letting Industry Council and the Property Institute to bring the sector together to write a letter to the Minister, which got some good traction and got some real movement. The Geospatial Commission picked it up and has made some changes from that. And the purpose of that letter was really twofold. One was to recognise what the public sector had already done, the government had done, and to encourage them to go to do more to support it. And secondly, to try and raise profile with the property sector to make sure that there was that end use demand. So there's sort of push and pull element. And that went well. And in 2004, in October last year, we wrote a letter to follow up. So it's very much the same letter, working with the Letting Industry Council to bring sector together. We had more industry bodies signing up to it. And so pretty much all of the bodies that are responsible for residential property or an element of it signed up to support the use of the UPRN and to encourage further steps to go ahead. And that was really looking at actually addressing some of the problems that we spoke about today. So look at the cost, look at awareness, look at how we make sure that things are built into the public sector. The UPRN is mandatory within new public sector projects, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's getting adopted. So how can we use that more and build that in? That said, there's been massive success, I think. So I think we could look at this as depressing that there's a long way to go, or really optimistic that we've come a long way. So I'm going to, at least for now, look backwards and be optimistic about it, is that the UPRN is now being built into an awful lot of projects. So a lot of software companies out there are building it in. A lot of the property companies are building it into their databases. Things like the Building Safety Regulator has built it in. The EPC certificates have built it in. A number of projects coming out. Land Registry are doing some good work to try and adopt that, although that's probably a question that may come up about the title as well, which I saw in the questions. So there's a lot of momentum behind that. There's a long way to go in my view, but there is also clearly some momentum behind it. I would like to think that the Real Estate Data Foundation and those supporting organisations, of which there are around 20 industry bodies, was a very small part of helping that momentum. But I think what's important is all about momentum, making it easier to adopt and getting that momentum, and then it becomes more and more valuable.
Okay, thanks, Dan. And both Emily and Simon, what role do organisations like GeoPlace and Ordnance Survey have in turning this vision into a reality, do you think?
Do you want to go, Emily?
Oh, thank you. I think where Dan mentioned there about things like EPC, I think one of our key roles as Ordnance Survey is supporting public sector adoption. So public sector organisations have access to our address products free at the point of use under the public sector geospatial agreement. So for them, the cost of acquisition there is not there, but supporting them to fulfil the mandate. So where they do publish open data that refers to address, that it does have the UPRN. I think that's key for us to help in that space.
And I'll just add, Nick, that things like the red letter are so important for us in terms of building the advocacy that works across the industry, getting those messages to decision makers, policy makers, never involved in any kind of transformation, digital transformation, or just system improvement or efficiency improvements. It's really important to get those non-technical messages through about what the UPRN can do and add value to. So yeah, we contribute to a lot of the cross-sector working between public sector and private sector. So there's a lot of data that needs to be shared between the public sector and the private sector around property. So we really do get involved as a collaborative team to make sure that departments that hold property information within government can work about how they can share that with the property sector. Local authorities have to do enforcement on property, so they get the UPRN and want to share that with other people that have to be involved in that process. So yeah, we're here to help and sort of oil the wheels of that across the property sector.
Wonderful, thank you. Thanks for everybody. Our final piece of the agenda is the future trends. And as we look into the future of the property sector, the outlook remains positive, with the market expected to continue on its steady growth. And this will be heavily influenced by how data is used across the industry in the future. So Emily, looking ahead, how do you see Ordnance Survey's data products evolving to meet the future needs of the property sector?
I think for us, there are a couple of different bits there. So that enhanced data, we will continue to do that and responding to market need. And I think predicting market need based on things we hear, things like the sort of Labour 5 principles, understanding their priorities and understanding what we need to do to support that. I think one of the questions that's come through in the chat, and it's not unique to the property sector, is around that earlier stage of the property life cycle. So I think understanding kind of what exists in the world today, I think we're very confident in that space. I think ensuring that we capture a UPRN at the earliest part of the property life cycle, and that can even be where land is transacted. So it doesn't necessarily need to relate to a property as we would understand it. So we're really focusing our efforts there to make sure that the UPRN is there for people to adopt at the earliest point they need it in the property life cycle. So yeah, for the next year, I would say that's probably our focus in my address and location portfolio.
Are there any specific innovations or advancements that you're particularly excited about?
Yes, so this is a shameless plug for some of our new releases that are coming out at the end of March. So they sit within our buildings theme within NGD. But probably the high level summary of it is all about roofs. So we've got like roof aspect, whether it's a green roof, whether the roof has solar panel. So again, really going into that kind of enhanced data gives people the opportunity to make the most accurate decisions in that property management process. So yeah, that will be launched by the end of this month. So yeah, keep an eye out on things like LinkedIn for us to be promoting that.
Brilliant, thanks. And Simon, as GeoPlace continues to grow and expand, what does the future look like for you guys, and how do you see your data evolving?
I think the demand we're seeing currently, which is ever increasing, is a growing set of data sets that can and will be linked to UPRNs to provide that additional attribution. I think we've moved on from the fact that people originally thought that they had to match all their data to UPRNs and throw away their own identifiers. What we're seeing now is people understand that the UPRN is an addition to what they already have. They don't have to throw away all the addresses they already use and the identifiers they already use, but simply adding the UPRN to what they've already got. Dan touched on this earlier, is kind of the next step to enable the data sharing to take place. So once we do that, you can then start to open up our wealth of data sharing opportunities and innovation around some of that data. So, for example, if you can start to do more on the fly and real-time validations and analysis of the data by using APIs. You can start to bring in some AI technologies perhaps to automate that and do a lot more crunching of the data. So I think that's what we're going to see. We're going to see more requests for putting the UPRNs against those data sets to increase that kind of the chain, if you like, of linked data that can be associated via the UPRN. And I think it will become part of our everyday lives. And yeah, I think Dan or Emily said it at the start that, you know, I don't think we'll use the UPRN as a conversational piece. It will be there in our phones. It's already there in our phones, you know, when we want to go somewhere. You know, sat nav and logistics companies, and it's all using the UPRN, but no one ever talks about it. So I think we'll see more of that with more automation and more sort of a digital economy.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Dan, with your work on the Real Estate Data Foundation, what new insights do you see emerging in the future, and who stands to benefit most from them?
I think there's probably so I think I'll come at this from a slightly different angle. I think one of the biggest problems from the UK's point of view at the moment is how do we fund all the houses and property and changes that need to be done. And one of the key elements of attracting investment into a market is its data infrastructure. It's not actually its data, it's more about its trust and its transparency, but the data is a key part of that. If you look around the world, other countries are investing huge amounts of money to build the data infrastructure that, for example, Ordnance Survey and GeoPlace play a large part of, along with others out there. So I think the first thing to say is that data is going to become more important to attracting investment, and I think that's going to be really important. The UPRN is a key part of that, along with the OS data, and I think that we need to really promote that more on an international basis. The second thing I would say is, building on from that, is having data in itself isn't that helpful if it's not accurate and it's not managed. And so I think a real theme is going to be trust in data. And so not only does the data have to be good, but it has to be trusted. And that in itself is a whole category of webinar. Maybe that's the next webinar about that Ideal Postcodes can do, is about trust of data. But having it trusted is really, really important. And then the final thing I would say is, it's just a word of caution, really, which is the property sector is slow. The public sector is slow, very often for very good reason. It's not a criticism. We shouldn't forget that an awful lot of the data that we want to tie together to really buy houses better, or to value them better, or to manage them better, are sitting in a back room in a big piece of paper somewhere. So in the public sector and the property sector, there's a lot of work for us to do to make all of this digital and the digital data-driven market that we want. That shouldn't be a reason not to do it, but it is just a word of caution that expecting for the next couple of weeks everything's going to shift, I think, is going to be unrealistic. I think this is a long journey that we're on. And if you look at where we've come from let's say 20 years ago as the property sector, we've come a long way, but we also have a long way to go. So I think three things for me are promoting this as investment on a world stage, making sure people understand that data itself isn't necessarily the good thing unless it's trusted, and then making sure that people are realistic about the timeframes that this will take.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much. Okay, our final piece of the agenda is to have a look at the poll results. If we can get those up, please. Okay, great. So the question was, what do you think is the biggest challenge in property data management today? And overwhelmingly, it looks like ensuring the data quality is the key there. Do we agree with that, the panel? Is there anything that you would say differently to that?
So certainly, I would entirely agree with that. I think that's very fair. I think you can, data quality means different things to different people. So I think you could dig into that again. But yes, quality of data is really important, and I think that goes back to that trust thing that I was talking about as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think when we talk about data quality, we mean the quality of the data in our address products, but also the quality of adoption of the UPRN. So it's both of those things together make the UPRN valuable. So yeah, for me, it is probably the highest priority.
Yeah, I'd agree as well. I mean, you've got a lot of high worth transactions happening in the property sector based on UPRN potentially. So we need to make sure the quality's there. also not just on sort of value of property, but also safety of people in properties. You know, if you've got the right high quality data, then that's really important. So yeah, totally behind that one as a high priority.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much. Our final piece is the question and answers from our audience. So I'm going to add some questions up now, and please feel free to answer as you see fit. I'm not going to direct anyone to take a question, but the question is: most conveyances use a title number to locate a property. All legal paperwork shows that the title number if the property is registered. How do you plan to replace link title numbers with UPRN numbers, and will UPRN numbers be shown on official copies? Who would like to take that one?
I can have a go. So I think there are two things here. One is we didn't envisage the UPRN would replace the title number. You know, the title number is used for land registry's purposes. The UPRN can be linked to it. I don't think there'll ever be a one-to-one relationship between the two, because some titles don't fit with the model of the UPRN, but that's fine. You can relate them on a kind of one-to-many and a many-to-one relationship. That's fine. It's a shame we haven't got anyone from Land Registry to answer the last bit of the question, but I know Land Registry are doing a lot of work already about linking UPRNs to their registered titles. So I think to cut a long story short, the work is underway, things are happening, title numbers are already being linked to UPRNs, a lot of work's been done on that. So how that comes out the other end, I know Land Registry are talking about already internally. And there was a letter from the Minister to the chair of the Land Registry Board quite recently, which is quite openly available to most people, that is saying, please, can you hurry up and complete that piece of work and make it available to the property sector.
So Nick, just if I could build on that very quickly. So I agree with everything that Simon said. I think it's worth noting that the title number and the UPRN or the address are talking about different things. There is often an overlap, and they can be the same sort of shape on a piece of ground, but they are talking about, one is talking about what is owned, the other one is about a building. So you could have multiple UPRNs in one title, or you could have one title and multiple UPRNs. So tying them together is going to be incredibly useful, because if you're looking at a building, you want to know who's the owner and how's that, what's the title, what's the situation, but they aren't quite looking at the same thing. So at least from my point of view, I wouldn't see there's any replacement of anything. The numbers themselves represent what's there, but the tying of them together is the important bit, and that's where the work is being focused on at the moment.
Okay, great, thank you. And Emily, would you like to add to that?
No, I think just to sort of acknowledge that the reference to UPRNs and Inspire IDs in the letter from MHCLG to inform HMLR priorities over the next year is really encouraging. I think, like Dan said, it's not going to happen overnight, but the more momentum we can keep behind UPRNs is great. So seeing that is a real encouraging thing for us.
Wonderful, thank you. And there's a question from Brian, really interesting and helpful. Thank you very much, Brian, really appreciate it. And what is the difference between UPRNs derived from open, freely available, like ONS UPRN directory, as opposed to UPRNs from Ordnance Survey and Ideal Postcodes? Who'd like to answer that?
I'm happy to take that one. I guess there are sort of different interpretations of this question, so I'll try and answer both. So the UPRNs themselves are the same. So the UPRNs that ONS are publishing in their UPRN directory are the exact same. They're talking about the same properties as sit in our open UPRN product and sit in our other address premium products. What ONS have done is produce a product that supports their ambitions, which is around underpinning statistical use. So the ONS UPRN directory contains links to areas like health codes, wards, parishes, things like that. So it is, as it says, it's a directory. So it's saying for this UPRN, it sits within these sort of statistical geographies. So sort of same data, same underpinning data with UPRNs, but different use cases.
Okay, brilliant, thanks. Okay, what is the next question, please? Okay, has EPC gone from address matching UPRNs to UPRN as a first class data identifier? And that's from Dan. Who would like to take that question?
I'll have a go. So yes, the EPC data is linked to UPRNs. It's a long process. What's been good to see is that the UPRN is assigned at the start of the process. Previously, it was kind of a post-work exercise, so addresses were captured in the field by EPC assessors and then linked to UPRNs. What we're seeing now is that the UPRN is assigned at the start of the assessment at that location of the property. So yes, it's nice to see them badged as a first-class identifier and the EPC register. So yeah, we work with MHCOG to try and make that the best it can be.
Thank you. And our next question is from Luke. And he says, are there any plans to provision OSNGD address theme as a transactional API like OS Places, or could we expect an additional attribution to filter with OS Places at some point? I guess that's for you, Emily.
Yeah, I think it'd be a bit shoddy to try and get someone else to answer that one. So I guess the good news, the good news from a data perspective, but possibly not from a product management perspective, is that OS Places is fed from the same data feed as NGD address. So OS Places existed kind of pre-NGD and was fed from address-based premium and was updated on a 6-weekly basis. So we've now sort of replumbed that behind the scenes. So it takes the same daily feed that we're using for NGD address and the same daily feed that we roll up into the 6-weekly products in our address-based family. So I guess by persisting the name, that may not be as apparent. And I think some of the confusion there is the attribute names still look very much like our address-based premium products rather than NGD address. So the underlying data is exactly the same. It's just formatted slightly differently. So it's our ambition to align the two so that the field names in OS Places will look more like NGD address. But yeah, the underlying data is exactly the same. So hopefully that's a good news story. But I think work for us to do there to communicate that if that's not already known.
Wonderful. Thanks, Emily. I think we've got one final question from our audience, which is from Andrew. And Andrew asks, can utility companies be treated the same as local government and be able to obtain UPRN data free of charge as a requirement for delivery of essential services? I'm assuming that's for you, Simon, or Emily.
I'd say it's probably more Emily, but
I think, you know what, it's more GDS, isn't it? Our government digital service, formerly Geospatial Commission. So access to our products free of charge or free at the point of use is governed by membership of the public sector geospatial agreement. So yeah, and that would be decided by government. So yeah, I'm really supportive of organisations having as many organisations as possible accessing our products. And ironically, in Scotland, I think Scottish Water is a public utility. They're a bit of an odd case there, and they're big, enthusiastic adopters of address, and they use UPRN throughout their processes. So yeah, we're absolutely convinced of the value of it, but the access, I think, is one for GDS to answer.
yeah, what I would just add to that, Nick, is that Ofgem, the regulator for sort of utilities, is part of the public service, public sector, the PSGA, so they would have access to it, and they have been involved in a number of projects working across the utility companies around use of the UPRN in the past. So there's already kind of a chink there to perhaps go on based on what Emily was saying.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, it's been an incredibly insightful session today, and thank you to all our panelists for sharing your expertise, and thank you all to our audience as well. So from UPRNs to enhanced property data, it's clear that we're at an exciting crossroads in the property sector, and it's great to see how much potential lies ahead. So thanks again to our amazing panelists and for everyone who joined us today and everyone who gave us a question. And be sure to keep an eye out on any follow-up materials that we will be sharing. Have a great day, and we hope to see you on our next session. Goodbye now.